Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 19, von Stueben, Gadsden, Yankee Doodle, and the Articles of Confederation. As we continue through the American Revolution, we continue to look at the seldom seen. One of those was, for me at least, Baron Friedrich von Stueben. I am ashamed to say that I had never even heard of him until I watched an episode of Drunk History, of all places. If you haven't seen it, or the show at all for that matter, I recommend you give it a watch. Today, with social media, YouTube, and so many streaming services competing for your attention and money, there are a plethora of options to not just learn, but also be entertained. And while it seems like it can be a cop-out for your history teacher to show you a crash course video every lecture, cut them some slack. The goal for most educators is to make history fun and engaging. If short video clips can do it, then keep going to it. Colonial American Hygiene. Personal hygiene in the 1700s was heavily maintained through a complicated balance of practicality, religious belief, and social position. Men and women living in colonial America washed their bodies and clothes with varying degrees of regularity, often falling victim to disease and disorder as a result. Despite the differing attributes of the original colonies, colonial hygiene in its earliest cities and rural settlements in America always left a lot to be desired, with odors, dirt, and waste being inescapable parts of daily life. Middle and upper class people tried to avoid or mask common nuisances like insects, usually to no avail, while lower classes struggled to survive. However, a lack of hygiene didn't go unnoticed, with dirt and grime thought to be indicative of bad manners and sloth. Full-body baths were uncommon until the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was usually only given to infants, not necessarily to clean them, but rather to harden them. Men, women, and children rinsed their faces and hands each morning, and there wasn't much more involved when it came to bathing. Individuals would use a basin, cloth, and maybe a sponge, wiping themselves off wherever they could to find privacy. Baths could be relatively common, but the soap was not used. Another technique was swimming, but dips in a nearby stream or lake were more of cooling off than getting clean. Bathtubs, reserved only for those who could afford them, were often only large enough for a sponge bath. Doctors were conflicted on personal hygiene, with some practitioners believing bodily oils and the like were essential to maintain health. Others thought cleanliness was necessary to keep disease and illness away. To compound those attitudes, bathing practices and the ideas about cleanliness in colonial America were heavily influenced by religious ideology. Puritans associated a lack of cleanliness with the devil and sin, connections that also had social implications. Cleanliness was directly connected to morality, and individuals who bathed were less likely to take part in sin, committing wrongdoings, and being poor. Water was purifying from head to toe, with the filthiness of person engendering filthiness of mind. Clean bodies, clean clothes, clean households, and clean settlements all contributed to spiritual health. Puritans struggled with the idea of bathing having negative implications for morality, however. Public baths, more specifically, were thought to contribute to disease and sexual impropriety. With no real dentist in colonial America, having a tooth that needed to be pulled meant a visit to the barber, surgeon, apothecary, or blacksmith. Before such an intervention was required to deal with toothaches, people used natural remedies like figs, chamomile, alcohol, and opium to numb the pain. There was little concern for keeping teeth clean while still in one's mouth, although replacing a pulled tooth was common. At times, the extracted tooth would be put back into the socket. More commonly, dentures and implants were used. New teeth were taken from poor individuals willing to sell their healthy chompers. Wood would be shaped to fit, or ivory and metal were used. The most famous denture wearer in the colonial period, George Washington, wore dentures made out of metal, wire, and animal teeth. His mouthpiece, however, constantly caused him pain and distorted the shape of his face. In colonial America, members of the middle and upper class wore powdered wigs. Men and women alike donned wigs made out of human and animal hair, while often keeping their hair very short. As lice were common, shaving one's head also helped prevent bugs from infesting hair. Wigs themselves were vulnerable to bugs, however. To keep them clean and presentable, individuals sent them out for regular treatments or had slaves and servants dress them. Ideally, wigs were cared for weekly, but it was a costly process, and people sometimes went weeks or months without getting a proper cleaning. Wigs could be boiled to get rid of lice, and they were often covered in fragrances that repelled bugs. Some familiar scents included bay leaves and sassafras. Powders and oils also hid the smell of a person and the hair itself, but pomades used to style wigs attracted insects that would get stuck in the sticky substance. Colonial households had outhouses, more accurately, a covered hole in the ground near their cabin. When individuals couldn't or didn't visit the outhouse, they could use the chamber pot inside. Chamber pots had to be emptied regularly, but were usually just dumped out the window or near the house. In rural settings, people often lived near water sources. Human waste found its way into streams, rivers, and lakes, contaminating drinking water and spreading disease. However, in urban centers like Philadelphia, privy pots excavated in 2014 revealed more than just the typical household and human waste. When archaeologists found a dozen brick-lined privy shafts between what was once an illegal tavern, they unearthed glasses, bottles, bowls, and drinking tankards. Other items included tanning supplies, wig curlers, and pottery made and used by local artisans. The human waste was present, but more than anything, the find, which dates from right around the Revolutionary War, gave a sense of people drinking and talking about politics and arguing. Archaeologists discovered a silver ear picker at the site of the original fort at Jamestown during the 1990s. The instrument, which dates to the early decades of the 17th century, had a pointed pick at one end with a small scooping tool at the other. Ear picks were used as toothpicks to clean out one's fingernails and for a variety of hygienic tasks. The spoon-like side of the ear picker may have been used to remove earwax, but it also proved helpful in collecting the valuable material. Instead of beeswax, earwax was applied to threads to prevent unraveling. Wealthy colonists may have imported fragrant soaps from Europe, but most colonists made their soap or purchased it locally. Lye soap, made from a mixture of animal fat, lye, and ash, in colonial America was harsh and used only to clean clothes, dishes, and parts of the home. Lye soap was made with little regard for measuring, and the process itself was time-consuming and smelly. The use of lye soap made doing laundry in colonial America that much more difficult. The harsh concoction, combined with hauling water, heating fires, wringing clothes, and hanging them to dry, added to an already exhausting task. As a result, only clothes that got the dirtiest, underwear, aprons, and diapers, were washed with any amount of regularity. The general absence of sanitation in rural and more heavily populated areas in colonial America meant the spread of disease. Outhouses and privy pots were often close to water sources and living quarters, while streets could be lined with animal waste, garbage, and refuse of all kinds. Common diseases including dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever, particularly prevalent among the hot summer months. An outbreak of bloody flux in Boston in 1676 claimed the lives of numerous children in the city, while the leader of Bacon's rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon Jr., suddenly succumbed to the disease the same year. Outbreaks of the waterborne illness broke out over and over again, striking civilians and soldiers alike. When George Washington and his troops camped at Valley Forge in December 1777, nearly two-thirds of Washington's 2,000 troops perished of dysentery, typhoid, and influenza. The dangers of campaigning during the winter were not as bad as during the summer, were not lost on military commanders either. However, outbreaks of disease, which may have contributed to colonial success as large numbers of British troops in the South fell victim to fever of all kinds. John Smith, the explorer, settler, and key figure in the administration of Jamestown's colony, wrote extensively about his impressions of the Americas. He described noisy creatures, notable mosquito and flies, and a certain India bug, which the Spaniards called a cockroach, the which creeping into chests they eat and defile with their ill-scented dung. He also called ants troublesome. Colonists endured lice as well, with George Washington commenting on his blanket was full of double its weight of vermin such as lice, fleas, and etc. A young man on an exploratory trip through the Shenandoah Valley in 1748, Washington found himself in bug-infested cabin. He learned his lesson, however, sleeping outside and too close to the fire on future outings. There's little evidence to suggest that women shaved any part of their bodies, primarily since conventions dictated women show no significant amount of skin. Even hair on a woman's face wasn't shaved, as part of shaving was dangerous and experienced hands could only prevent bloodbaths. Women may have plucked their hairs or used a cream instead. Several recipes and medical handbooks circulated in England and the colonies. Specifically, The Birth of Mankind included recipes that would combine limestone, arsenic, and other substances. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington made it clear that sanitation and cleanliness were essential to health and service, ordering his officers to pay attention should any disease or contagion enter the military camps. His main concern at the time was smallpox. He later called the troops to be inoculated against it. But Washington knew the military bases bred disease. Soldiers were supposed to wash their shirts weekly while cleaning their faces and hands daily. Many men ignored these orders. To maintain camp cleanliness, followers, as they were known, traveled with the military, cooking and cleaning for the men all the way. Women provided essential services to men who, from one witness's perspective, were not used to doing things of this sort, and let their linens, etc., rot upon their backs than to be troubled of cleaning themselves. Attitudes about bathing during the colonial period in America were not uniform, but some of the country's founding fathers were clear in how they viewed cleanliness of women. Thomas Jefferson, for example, told his daughter Martha, "Nothing is so disgusting to our sex as to want a cleanliness and delicacy in yours." In the late 18th century, doctors advised women to bathe, in large part to cure illnesses that affected female reproductive organs. While Thomas Ewell, a doctor from Virginia, acknowledged the prevailing wisdom that women were so constituted as to become offensive to the nose to suppress too ardent devotions of males. Cleanliness was the highest of order. Women may use smell as a means of defense to ensure protection by rendering themselves as disgusting as possible, but the stench was offensive to all women. Baron Friedrich von Stueben. In 1777, the rebellion in England's colonies, destined to become the American Revolution, was going badly. 13 desperate and mutually suspicious colonies were not yet unified in disciplined force. The army desperately needed training, and in Paris, Benjamin Franklin found the one man he believed could save them, Baron Friedrich von Stueben. Stueben was a particularly valuable aid to the most significant military genius of his era, King Friedrich II of Prussia. Because Friedrich was Europe's most notorious gay ruler of all time, von Steuben's ready acceptance into the king's all-male court was the first historical suggestion that von Steuben was, himself, homosexual. Though it is unknown whether Benjamin Franklin knew of von Steuben's homosexuality, he was convinced that the Prussian penchant for order and discipline was precisely what the American forces needed to prevail in their uphill fight against the well-trained British army. At first, von Steuben declined Franklin's entries. But when it became clear the Prussian clergy intended to prosecute him for homosexual activities, the pending scandal proved a convincing argument for him to accept Franklin's offer. Since the reason for von Steuben's self-imposed exile did not become widely known until the Revolutionary War, it is unlikely the Americans were aware of it when Franklin concluded his negotiations with von Steuben. Since the Continental Congress isn't able to pay for even von Steuben's travel expenses, let alone a salary for his services, the French government secretly agreed that it would compensate him. Von Steuben arrived in America in the company of a 17-year-old handsome French nobleman who served as his secretary and translator. Unfortunately, his teenage protege was quickly proved so ignorant of military ways that he was an inept interpreter. General George Washington intervened by assigning 2 French-speaking colonels from his staff, the 20-year-old Alexander Hamilton and the 24-year-old John Lawrence, to assist von Steuben. The assignment proved prescient in that Hamilton and Lawrence have been surmised by historians to have been lovers. After this initial review of the troops presented to him, von Steuben set out writing a drill book. To assist, Washington ordered 100 top soldiers selected from the infantry to form a model training brigade. The uniform drills of the fledgling Continental Army began on March 19, 1778. Von Steuben led them himself, a fact that greatly impressed the enlisted men who saw him not only as a washed-up European adventurer, but as a military man who was going to help them win battles. 3 days after the first drills were performed, a duly impressed George Washington ordered von Steuben's training to be extended to his entire command. 5 weeks after the first drill, Washington appointed von Steuben to First Inspector General of the Army. A year later, Congress enacted his regulations for the order and discipline of troops of the United States. In 1780, he received his coveted field appointment as a division commander in the war's final siege at Yorktown. Von Steuben's impact of the Revolutionary War cause was incalculable. Indeed, some historians have counted Friedrich von Steuben, along with George Washington himself, as the only 2 men whose services were indispensable to the success of the Revolution. The Gadsden Flag. The Gadsden Flag harks back to the American Revolution when colonists were tired of living under British rule and took up arms against the mother country. Contemporary Americans generally recognize the Gadsden Flag for its distinctive yellow background, the coiled rattlesnake, and the simple motto, "Don't tread on me." The rattlesnake theme started in 1751 when the Pennsylvania Gazette, owned and printed by Benjamin Franklin, ran a story protesting England sending its convicts to America. In retribution, the paper suggested sending a shipment of rattlesnakes to England so that the snakes could live in British nobles' gardens. At the subsequent 25 years, the snake symbol became a rallying point for colonial unity to stand up against the Crown's tyranny. By 1775, the Continental Congress ordered the creation of the Navy to combat the importation of arms to the colonies. Christopher Gadsden, a representative of the Continental Congress from South Carolina, suggested the new 4-ship fleet and its 5 Marines, 5 companies, fly under a unified flag and symbol. Gadsden presented the yellow flag with the rattlesnake "Don't Tread on Me" to the Continental Congress, and the legislative body approved. The flag flew on the Alfred, the lead ship in Commodore Essex Hopkins' fleet, and the 5 companies of Marines painted the symbol on their drums. The snake symbol became the personal standard of Hopkins and the Continental Navy as it underwent its first successful mission to the Bahamas in 1776. A keen observer of American history, probably Franklin, wrote an article to Pennsylvania Journal explaining why the rattlesnake was an appropriate symbol at the time. The rattles showed 13 segments, which presented the 13 colonies. Singularly, each segment doesn't make noise, but collectively, the rattle warns anyone to stay away. The rattlesnake is native to North America instead of Europe, and the animal can deliver deadly strikes with its fangs, but only after someone provokes it. The symbol was entirely appropriate for the time, and even today as Navy ships and Marine units carry the flag. The Gadsden Flag is a symbol as old as America itself. The emotion behind the flag stands for the American Revolution and the dangers anyone faces when impeding on Americans' rights and civil liberties, even though the roots of the flag go way back past 2 centuries. For historical reasons, the Gadsden Flag is still popularly flown in Charleston, South Carolina. In the city, Christopher Gadsden first presented the flag and where it was commonly used during the Revolution, along with the blue and white crescent flag of pre-Civil War South Carolina. In the 1970s, the Gadsden Flag started being used by libertarians, using it as a symbol representing individual rights and limited government. The Libertarian Free State Project uses a modified version of the flag with the snake replaced with a porcupine, a symbol of the movement. In 2009, the Gadsden Flag became widely used as protest symbol by the American Tea Party movement protesters. Members of Congress also displayed it at Tea Party rallies. In some cases, the flag was ruled to be a political rather than historical or military symbol due to the strong Tea Party connection. The Gadsden Flag has also been used as a symbol by far-right groups and individuals. In 2014, the flag was used by Jared and Amanda Miller, the perpetrators of the 2014 Las Vegas shootings who killed 2 police officers and civilians. The Millers reportedly placed the Gadsden Flag on a corpse of one of the officers they killed. The Gadsden Flag was featured prominently in a story surrounding the 2021 storming of the United States Capitol, where 34-year-old Roseanne Boland was allegedly trampled to death while brandishing it over her shoulder. Yankee Doodle. The Yankee Doodle tune was already well known by the 1750s, but tradition says that in 1755 a British doctor named Richard Shuckburgh penned new words to mock his American allies. He portrayed the colonists as rude, crude, and cowardly. In the song, Shuckburgh referred to the American fighters as both a doodle, a country hick, and a dandy, which is an arrogant jerk. No one has ever figured out exactly where the term Yankee comes from. One guess is that Yankee started as a nickname Little Jan, used by Dutch settlers by the time. The Brits used it to mock all American colonists. Later, of course, it became the name of a very famous New York baseball team. At the time of the French and Indian War, the colonies, stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south, belonged to Great Britain. By 1770, the government of Great Britain's King George and some American colonists were not getting along very well. Many Americans were muttering about forking extra taxes to help pay for British wars, including the French and Indian War. British leaders thought it only fair that Americans pay their share of war expenses. Tensions rose. Colonial leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Hancock began to talk about rebellion. The feud came to a head in 1775. In the early mornings of April 19, some 700 British soldiers in bright red uniforms marched out of Boston. The British mission was to snatch weapons and ammunition they believed the Americans had stashed in the countryside. 2 colonial spies, Paul Revere and William Dawes, rode out to spread the alarm the British regulars were on their way. At the time, Great Britain fielded the most powerful army and navy in the world. Their officers and well-trained troops felt little fear of the Minutemen, colonial farmers and townsfolk who volunteered as soldiers. Reports say that British fifers and drummers teased the colonists by playing Yankee Doodle as their columns snaked along rural roads. In the small town of Lexington, the British soldiers confronted a line of Minutemen on the village green. A gun went off, British muskets opened fire, and in an instant, 8 Americans were dead or dying. British forces then continued towards Concord and destroyed the weapons they fought. Now, the British Army had to take a march back to safety of Boston. Colonial militiamen swarmed to the attack, taking up positions along the route. They hid behind trees and rock walls, picking off soldiers after soldier. Some British troops broke rank and ran. Others, angered by American tactics, broke into houses and set them on fire. Eventually, more British troops arrived from Boston to rescue the survivors. Legend has it that the colonial militiamen returned the musical insult as they counterattacked. They sang Yankee Doodle as British soldiers retreated. It was as if the Americans were singing, "How do you like us Yankee Doodle dandies now?" The American Revolution had begun. Yankee Doodle soon took hold as an unofficial anthem of what became the American Continental Army. The last major battle of the Revolutionary War took place near Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. American troops and French Navy blasted a chunk of the British Army there. Some witnesses reported that Yankee Doodle accompanied the British surrender too. The Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war, was signed 2 years later. The United States of America was now its own independent country. Over time, new verses of Yankee Doodle were added, changed, moved, and removed. A verse about George Washington, for example, was tacked on after he took command of the Continental Army in June 1775. Interestingly, one of the most familiar verses does not appear until 1842. Today, it is the first verse of the song that every American knows. Yankee Doodle went to town, a-ridin' on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. The Miscellaneous Stories of the Revolutionary War. The American Revolution is full of reasonably well-known figures and events. George Washington, the Boston Tea Party, and the Declaration of Independence are all part of Revolutionary-era history. This is generally common knowledge, but there are many facts about the Revolutionary War that you may not have heard. Sybil Ludington was 16 years old when she climbed up on her horse and warned off British arrival on April 26, 1777. As the daughter of a colonel in the local Connecticut regiment, Ludington was dispatched to call members of the militia to arms. Accounts vary as to whether or not she volunteered, but a later report indicated that she bade her take a horse, ride for the men, and tell them at this house by daybreak. Ludington was said to have ridden between 20 and 40 miles in the rain overnight, alerting men on farms about an impending attack. By the time Ludington was done, hundreds of troops were rallying to take on the British. Ludington differs from the better-known messenger of war, Paul Revere, who had made a comparable ride 2 years earlier. Unlike Revere, Ludington avoided getting caught. At the Battle of Germantown in October 1777, General George Washington led his men against British General William Howe. The battle itself resulted in a loss for the colonists, with several failed assaults, resulting in about 1,000 casualties. During the exchange, a dog appeared on the battlefield. When American forces got close enough to read the animal's collar, it said that General Howe was the dog's owner. Washington had his secretary, Alexander Hamilton, write a note to Howe to accompany the dog upon its return. General Washington's compliment to General Howe. Howe does himself the pleasure to return him a dog, which accidentally fell into his hands. By the inscription on the collar appears to belong to General Howe. Conrad Hayter was a native of Maine. Although he was born in 1749, it was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hayter was a farmer who had served with the Continental Army, reportedly joining in 1775. In his own words, Hayter, quote, "did serve term of 1 year in the Army, received my discharge, which was an honorable discharge, about the middle of December 1777, end quote. A later revised pension claim stated that he was discharged in 1778. Hayter lived to be 106 years old, dying in 1856. During his long life, he is thought to be the first human being ever photographed. The picture of Hayter was taken in 1852, when he was 103 years of age. As the British took more and more prisoners during the occupation of New York, they ran out of places to put them. Captives were soon transferred to ships in Wallabout Bay, part of the New York Bay, where they had faced overcrowded and filthy conditions. There were not enough supplies to feed all the prisoners, potable water was lacking, and disease was endemic. On ships like the HMS Jersey, thousands of American prisoners perished. According to records, they indicate roughly 11,000 deaths occurred between 1776 and 1783. However, the total number of fatalities at battles during the Revolutionary War falls between 6,800 and 8,000. Using what is known as the turtle, American soldiers sent an egg-shaped vessel made of wood in the direction of the British ships on September 7, 1776. Invented by David Bushnell, the turtle was about 8 feet long, had a timed bomb on board, and could hold one man to shoot the torpedo. Ezra Lee was inside the turtle when it launched into New York Harbor in September 1776. He successfully placed a bomb on the hull of the British HMS Eagle but was unable to secure it. When it went off, it was close to the ship but didn't cause any significant damage. Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, William, was the governor of New Jersey when the Revolutionary War broke out. As a longtime supporter of the British Crown, the younger Franklin didn't sway from the affiliation but instead spent time in prison for his dedication to King George III. During the 1760s, Benjamin and William were on good terms, but siding with the British was more than the elder Franklin could handle. William went to England in 1782, and even though he attempted to make amends with his father, Benjamin would have none of it. Instead, he said, "Nothing has ever hurt me so much as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son." And he never forgave him. The Revolutionary War didn't officially come to an end until 1783 in the signing of the Treaty of Paris. When representatives of the newly formed United States met with the British officials, they set the border between the U.S. and existing British territories, indicating it extended through Lake Superior northward to the Isles of Royal and Philippot, and beyond. The problem is, however, is that the island of Philippot was never been located. The treaty itself was informed by maps made during the early 1700s, like the 1742 map of Jacques Nicolas Belin and Mitchell maps made during the 1750s, later found to be inaccurate. It wasn't until 1820 that surveyors determined that there was no Isle Philippot. Born in 1747, Francis Salvador traveled to the British colonies in 1773 or 1774. Soon after, Salvador was elected to the General Assembly in South Carolina, and in 1775, he was chosen to be a member of the first Provisional Congress. The plantation owner was the first Jew to hold legislative office in the Americas and was an ardent supporter of independence. And Native American allies of the British carried out raids in South Carolina. Salvador fought with the militia to combat their efforts. On July 31, 1776, Salvador was shot and, as he laid fallen, was scalped. His commanding officer, Major Andrew Williams, described the scene. "When I came up to him after dislodging the enemy and speaking to him, he asked whether I had been beaten the enemy. I told him yes. He said he was glad of it, shook me by the hand, bade me farewell, and said he would die in a few minutes." Salvador was 29 years old when he died, and, despite his plans, was never able to bring his wife and children to the Americas to join him. The embargoes implemented by the United States during the Revolutionary War hurt the economy of Bermuda while simultaneously starving its residents. Merchant Henry Tucker wrote to his son in Virginia describing, quote, "the most dreadful calamities by the present contest between Great Britain and the colonies, should both parties demand a compliance with their respective measures," end quote. Tucker attempted to reach an agreement with government officials in Philadelphia. In 1775, he came up with an arrangement that would benefit both parties. Benjamin Franklin wanted the gunpowder stockpile in Bermuda, and Tucker would get it for him. Tucker gathered several men to steal gunpowder in August 1775. They broke into the top, just let a man down, and the doors most audaciously and daringly forced open, at great risk of their being blown up. They took 126 barrels, about 3,150 pounds, and it sent to the U.S., where it quadrupled the colonial army had on hand. Immortalized by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Paul Revere's Ride, the titular literary figure was part of the American colonial militia during the Revolution. Born in 1734, Revere took over his family's silversmithing shop after his father's death. After serving in the Provisional Army during the late 1750s and 1760s, Revere married and returned to silversmithing. He also began work as a dentist, which helped him supplement his income during times of economic decline. Revere earned a reputation for making and fitting dentures and even advertised as such in local newspapers. Whereas many persons are so unfortunate to lose their 4 teeth by accident and other ways, to the great detriment, not only in looks but speaking both in public and private, this is to inform all such that they may have replaced with artificial ones, that look as well as a natural and answers the end of speaking to all intents, by Paul Revere, goldsmith, near the head of Dr. Clark's Wharf, Boston. Many scholars identify the Boston Tea Party in 1773 as the watershed moment for coffee in the British colonies. Once tea, one of the 3 caffeinated beverages, was associated with the English crown, it became synonymous with the enemy. In a written exchange between John Adam and an innkeeper in 1774, Adams asked about the availability of tea at the establishment. He was told, quote, "We have renounced all tea in this place. I can't make tea, but I can make you coffee." End quote. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.